Hello and welcome to Global South Adda. If you have followed us, you will know that at Global South Adda, we endeavor to discuss issues that concern or shape knowledge production in the discipline of international relations in the Global South. Our attention is usually to the everyday aspects of thinking, researching, and writing on the Global South. Much of our focus in our previous discussions has been on international relations, specifically in India. So today we travel across the border, at least figuratively, and discuss issues about studying, teaching, and writing about international relations in Pakistan. Our focus here would be more specifically on the state of strategic studies in Pakistan. And I'm elated to be speaking today with Sadia Tasleem, who is currently finishing her PhD at McGill University in Canada. Sadia is also a lecturer at the Quaid-i-Azam University in Islamabad, where she teaches in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. She's worked extensively on strategic stability, nuclear learning, and the implications of knowledge diffusion with a focus on Pakistan. Sadia, thank you so very much for agreeing to be part of this conversation and joining us all the way from Canada.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a 10-hour time difference, but I'm so very glad to have you, and I'm actually very excited to have you today. Before we get into sort of conversations about, the discipline, knowledge production, and so on and so forth, could you give us a bit of a idea of your own background? What did you study? How did you get into working on, issues like nuclear deterrence, and how did you get into working in strategic studies in Pakistan? So a bit of a background about yourself and your journey to where you are
now. I grew up in a relatively small town, small in terms of sort of on the development scale, and mostly like on the suburbs of the town. And it was just like most ordinary Pakistanis. My family had been sort of interested in education, and my uncles and aunts were all like educated. So there was a lot of focus on taking studies seriously. But interestingly enough, like most South Asian parents and most South Asian sort of families probably, that there was a lot of push towards going to medicines or engineering, and those are the professions that were considered like acceptable and respectable. For some reason, I think even when I was growing up, I had a very strong sense and awareness of social injustices in the society. And I think that somehow triggered something in me. So I wanted to become a lawyer as opposed to a doctor. By the time of my high school, I felt a bit convinced that I should maybe just listen to what the elders are saying, maybe pay more attention to medicines. And then a few things happened in the family, like in terms of tragedies and challenges on the medical front. And I thought that I'm not like prepared to get into a field which is so sort of emotionally demanding and challenging. And I should just think about like studying law and fighting for social justice and things like that. And then by the time I finished my high school, one of my uncles is a lawyer. So he was asked by one of my aunts to persuade me not to get into law school because, again, like there are a lot of challenges in the law school, in the law as a field for women. So he spoke to me. He was like, "You don't want to get into the kind of filth that people have to face when they are fighting cases against criminals and things like that. And think about it. There are a lot of other things that you can do, and think about it." So I thought that the other way was to study political science, get into civil bureaucracy, and then change the world. That was like those innocent sort of dreams of the teenagers and like people in their late teens. It's like you think that you are too big to change the world, and those motivations. So I was like, I have to do something about the world and about changing the world. One way is to get into civil bureaucracy. So I started studying political science and English literature for my undergrad to sit for the civil services examination. But then General Musharraf overturned Nawaz Sharif's government. There was a military coup, and then he literally sort of destroyed the basis of the civil bureaucracy. And that was a moment of sort of realization that you can't like really change the world that way. It's like you get into a job and the next day there's a military dictator, and how are you going to sort of really do anything about it? So then I thought that maybe I need to think about something more sort of stable through which sort of I can have an impact. And all through this time period, like another one of my father's actually eldest brother, he was having a conversation with me on my like choices, career choices and all. And he said like the kind of things that you're interested in studying and exploring, why don't you try to apply for strategic studies? I was very deeply sort of interested in understanding the question of power and the question of sort of war. I was reading Che Guevara and revolutionaries and like the Soviet Revolution in my undergrad years. So there was like that kind of idealist sort of passion. So he said that like you might actually find that feel interesting because it aligns a lot with you. And I thought that's one way of understanding the questions of power. And then sort of once you understand that, you can sort of really do something about it. And by that time, I thought like my career choice is going to be teaching, because that's much more sort of stable in terms of having an impact. You can help people understand things, train them, and all of that stuff. That's again like something that over a period of time you realize your own limitations in some ways, but in that phase of idealism, everything looks like pretty neat. So I applied to Quaid-i-Azam, got accepted, and did my master's in defense and strategic studies, my MPhil in defense and strategic studies. But it was during that time period when I I had some expectations from what I would study, but I would say that it wasn't really, it was in some ways very different from what I had expected. So being a student of political science, I thought there'd be much more political theory, much more engagement with like, when we'll talk about strategy, or when we'll talk about questions of war or national security, they'll be more embedded in political theory. That wasn't the case. It was interesting in a sense that in some ways I felt that there was a lot of stuff that was new for me, and just the newness of it, I think in some ways enchanted me. In some ways it had an impact, and I wasn't really fully engaging with it as critically as I started doing over a period of time, like in the later years, once I understood the discipline fully. So in the earlier stages, it was much more sort of feeling captivated, okay, and like your professors coming in the class, you feel like, oh, these people know so much, because you don't really know anything about any of that discipline. So you don't really understand the disciplinary confines, you don't really understand their limitations. You are sort of engaging with whatever is coming to you, you're receiving it very happily, and sort of getting, in some ways, you get molded into that kind of sort of disciplinary environment, right? So the funny thing is, and now when I look back at like my own student years and then sort of my experience as a professional, I always find it ridiculous and funny, and I always tell this to my students as well, that I was trained to be a realist, and realist in a Waltzian sense. So not a realist in sense of car, if you would want to put each car into that frame, or the political realists. There are so many of them who had like something sort of much more meaningful to say probably, but it was like realism of a very, very Waltzian sense that's predominant at my department where I studied and where I teach. So I was trained in that way, and I thought that this made so much sense that I wrote an assignment and then got it published in a magazine on More May Be Better, which was like a Waltz's standard argument, and then like advocating how more states of nuclear weapons might actually be a very good idea, because this is sort of drilled into our minds in our classrooms in such a way that nothing else made any sense to us, right? And then you are like you're coming from a state which sees itself as like at a disadvantage in the world at large and vis-a-vis its adversaries or neighboring states, and you're fed into sort of a lot of that kind of propaganda of how vulnerable Pakistan is and how threatened Pakistan is and all of that stuff. And then the wars would make perfect sense to you, right? So, and this is what happens to a lot of students. They get sort of so captivated by like what wars is saying and all. And so was I. Anyways, I should always admit that. And then in my MPhil, so I was thinking more about studying, about like doing my research on perception management and psychological warfare and those kinds of things, because over a period of time, you begin to sort of feel that there's something that's that you are sensing, but you are not really in a position to fully comprehend what's going on. And I was feeling that there's something that I'm not fully understanding with respect to psychological warfare. Like it's not just an external phenomena. Maybe there's something going on like at a more domestic level. And I spoke to my professor, and he said that I'm not really sure if you should do this, because it's a subject that anybody can work on, and a lot of people do it, even in psychology and other departments. And I think there's another area which is much more challenging. Nobody has worked on it. It's nuclear missile export control regimes. And I think you should give it a try. So I said, okay, I'll just go through some of the stuff to familiarize myself with it, because it was back in 2004, nobody had really looked into export control regimes in Pakistan. A.Q. Khan crisis had just come out, and sort of this was a huge question in Pakistan as to what does it mean, like the question of sort of legitimacy of those kinds of actions and things like that. So I thought that was interesting. So in that sense, like my research orientation towards nuclear weapons basically was developed during that time. So I started studying nuclear missile export control regimes, and I found it very interesting. But over a period of time, I also sort of realized that there was a lot more about nuclear weapons that I wanted to and needed to understand. It was still very much in within the status quoist kind of a framework that I was looking at these things. So then I started sort of also like with my studies, I started teaching at IR department at the National University of Modern Languages, and then for a year, and then I moved to National Islamic University for a very short, like 6 months research project. And then I was accepted into the National Defense University's think tank, Institute for Strategic Studies, Research and Analysis. And that was I think that was a very important moment in my life, and in terms of my understanding of things and my career, because that was a time when I saw how military functions, right, like from a closer sort of proximity. So in my department at Quaid-i-Azam, we also used to have people from armed forces, but it's like a small group that studies with students. They come to get the degree. So it's like 5 to 6 people in every class. And they don't like, back then at least, now when I'm teaching, I see that they engage much more actively. But most of my classmates who were from armed forces were not very vocal about things, at least in the classroom setting. So I never understood like what was actually happening inside military institutions. And I come from a civilian family, so I didn't have that kind of an understanding. So I thought like one of the attractive part of going to the National Defense University was that I'll get to know how military functions, and that's important for my discipline and my disciplinary understanding and things like that. Part of it was also also that like it was a very senior position. I wasn't like I was pretty young for that. They required like 10 years of experience and things like that. And then they made an exception for me just because the president and you who interviewed me was happy somehow with whatever I was doing and saying. So interestingly enough, I was the only woman in that sort of entire institute, and far younger than like all the people. I mean, this was all like senior military officers. And then it was interesting because at times like people would be, so some of the students that I had at the NDU, people, I would supervise their thesis, so of some of the officers. And the first time they would look at me, they would be like, "We are here for Madam Sadia," and I'd be like, "I am Madam Sadia." So they'll be shocked because they would be like, "We thought there's somebody much more senior and all," but eventually, like over a period of time, generally we had like good experiences and all. Anyway, so working at the NDU, I think was pivotal in a sense that one, I think it helped me really appreciate the institutional dynamics of the army. So from a distance, it always looked like this was a very professional institution where everything is done to perfection, and it's like they know what they are doing, they understand strategy, they understand everything regarding sort of their regarding the military stuff, right? When you are part of the conversations, you begin to know sort of at times like you see shallowness, at times you see that there isn't like really that kind of deep engagement with thought itself, and it's like much more superficial. Then you also see how much people are sort of how much of their understanding of stuff is based on what they are reading, for example, in terms of like the US literature or things that are not necessarily applicable to Pakistan. So it was like a kind of an opening up for me in many ways. The other good thing about working at the NDU was that this was the time when I started doing work more independently. So before that, like I was in this environment where I was being trained. At the NDU, it was a much more senior position. I was responsible for everything that I was writing and saying. And so it was not like a student mod anymore, right? So I was exploring stuff on my own, sitting in library for sort of hours, just looking at stuff more independently without any supervisor or any guidance. And I think that opened up my eyes to a lot of interesting literature. So one thing that's good about NDU is that they have a really, really nice library, despite the fact that like a lot of people would probably still read the standard stuff, the standard literature, but they get a lot of books that are not necessarily sort of conventional theory stuff. So I think in that sense, like this opened up my horizons, and over a period of time, also traveling and going to other places, participating in international workshops, programs, speaking at different events, and then meeting people working in the field in other parts of the world, what kind of questions they are thinking about looking at. And those kinds of things also sort of, I think, helped me sort of broaden my horizon, think about things in a more different way, but also understand like the weaknesses of the kind of realism-centric discourse that we have in defense and strategic studies in particular. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. And then sort of from there on, I enrolled in a PhD program at my own university, but then I also sort of I started working on it, worked on it for a long while, but there were different kinds of issues that I was sort of uncomfortable with. One of them was the kind of inbreeding that I thought I was going through, and just decided to withdraw. And then over the last few years, I was thinking of pursuing a PhD, but I wasn't really sure whether I should go to the US or someplace else. And I think Trump's coming to power was in some ways a decisive moment for me to feel that like I should just not consider the US. And I decided to apply to the UBC and got accepted. And yeah, okay. So now I'm working on it.
Brilliant. You've given us like a whole map of things that I can now actually ask you questions about. But what I really thought was fascinating, in fact, sort of all of us go through that phase in some ways, but in your case, it's even more starker, is that, one starts with this understanding of the world, this idealistic notions about reading Che Guevara and Russian Revolution. And that's inspiration to get into studies, and then Waltzes you, right?
Yeah.
He's the perfect post-colonial thinker when he says, more the better, give everyone a nuclear weapon, and all that. But also, interestingly, there is this, the more abstract the language, the more is the allure of that language, right? These concepts sort of grip you, and they become commonsensical. And but in your case, the closer you get to that power, and the closer you get to people who sort of manifest that power, the more disillusioned you get, because you start to realize that things are much more messier than how they appear in theory, and so on and so forth. I want to sort of segue into sort of, I mean, there are a whole lot of other things that you've highlighted, and I'll try and sort of ask you about those specific things later. But here I wanted to sort of segue into the broader issues that you also sort of hinted at with, strategic studies in Pakistan. So what are sorts of the key issues, key problems, or, that plague, or that, in a way, that hamper strategic studies in the country? But also, could you sort of give us a bit of a overview of how, for instance, strategic studies in Pakistan is different from, say, a general IR department, or is like strategic studies mostly the IR? Like when we did, when I did my MA, of course, realism was the main, that's mostly what you're taught. But then in MPhil, there's a course on realism, there's another course on advanced course on realism, and so on and so forth. So you're sort of hammered with the realism left, right, center. And that's most of what IR was about. So it's very easy then to sort of move into strategic studies, because that's mostly what you've been taught. So in Pakistan, so what sort of, is there sort of a range of scholarship on other issues of, say, even within security, critical security studies, and so on and so forth? Now, I know I've asked you several questions there, but sort of a general lay of the land before.
Yeah, I'll try to sort of answer all of them, but in case I miss out on something, so just sort of prop up. I would say like strategic studies is very heavily realism centric in Pakistan, but it's slightly, so I would not, I can't speak about all the universities, public sector universities in Pakistan, and how things are in different parts of the country. I'm not fully familiar with that. I'm more aware of how things are taught in Islamabad. There are really like closer areas that I have more interaction with. I think, and more specifically to Quaid-i-Azam where I teach. So at Quaid-i-Azam, I think in IR, if so a student would study a course on theories of international relations, right? So in theories of international relations, despite the fact that some of their professors might actually have a very strong realist bias, and they might eventually end up converting a lot of students to realism, there is still a range of theories that students get familiarized with, at least in the beginning, right? At TSS department, it's a very sort of, in some ways, a very policy-oriented department. It's not very academic in terms of its like course structure, and in terms of like the kind of sort of teaching that's imparted and all. So in that sense, there isn't really a lot of focus on theories as such. There isn't really any sort of specific course on theory. So for example, theories of strategic studies or things like that. Like theories of war is taught in like a broader course called war, where you are taught like war, causes of war, and in that sense theories. But students are not familiarized with social constructivism, critical theory, postmodernism, all of these, like feminism, Marxism. There's no conversation on that. Interestingly enough, like Marxism is probably the least talked about, the least understood concept, even in the broader sort of general IR community. It's so sort of so out of the scene post Zia sort of whatever destruction he did in the name of reforms or whatever. Anyway, so so when it comes to theoretical foundation, I think strategic studies is very, very weak in terms of like helping students build strong theory. IR, I would still assume that at least you get to know. So people would, for example, in conferences, people who are working in strategic studies, they would very proudly say that we are realists, right? The problem is that there's so little focus on theory that there isn't really a full understanding of what realism is, right? As I said earlier, it's a Waltzian realism that most of the people would subscribe to. So there's very little understanding of the nuances even within realism. And then there is no engagement with those nuances. It's like there was a Pakistani scholar wrote a paper on status of IR, something on like general status of IR in South Asia Research Journal, and he was basically sort of he was basically arguing that it's a realism-centric discourse there, so IR and strategic studies, and it's like dominated by the military, and that's why like the idea of sovereignty is so important in this discourse and all. And when I was reading that paper a few months ago, I was actually thinking that probably it's not, it's a very simplistic explanation. There isn't, so for example, if it's all about sovereignty, if it's all about security, there'll be real open debate about what it is that helps you sort of strengthen your security, what improves your security qualitatively, right? And even if it has to be within the realist sort of confines, there's much more sort of space to maneuver, much more space to navigate. It wouldn't be sort of, yes, we have to have nuclear weapons, yes, we have to have second strike capability, and that's how like we are going to achieve security. That's, it's not a sort of, it's not a very open, very thorough kind of debate. So you begin to feel that people themselves are sort of so trapped by certain myopic ideas about a theory. And again, there are reasons for why they are trapped into this idea, and I'll try to refer to that at some point in the conversation.
Can I just intervene to say, so do I hear you correct? And this is sort of my problem also with a lot of like even people in India and elsewhere when they talk about realism. It's sort of that, you know, most of the times when people are talking about realism, it's not really realism they're talking about. It's about more like the neocons, right? Neoconservatives who have certain views of national interest, you know, who have certain views of their own exceptionalism and so on and so forth. Whereas realist theory, or several realist theories, do not necessarily, you know, say the same thing that neocons would say. But everything is labeled as realism, which is not really realism. So I don't particularly have a problem with realism. I have a problem with, you know, sort of this exceptionalist narrative that is sort of couched as realism. Do you think that's?
I think that's I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think it's very difficult to really put a label onto what's going on in places like Pakistan, for example, and particularly in strategic studies. I mean, it's easy to have a linear, beautiful, straightforward narrative saying, well, because it's a state having a history of 4 military coups with military as the dominant power. It has a very myopic view of state security and sovereignty, and therefore its ideas align with realism, and realism is promoted on purpose to sort of ensure that the status quo prevails. When I look at how things are on ground, I feel that there is, and again, like I don't want to sort of, undermine the kind of influence that military has on academia and on research and other things in Pakistan, and particularly when it comes to security issues. And that's a huge, like that's a separate issue, a huge issue, and there are a lot of problems there that need to be talked about and discussed. But I also see a lot of problem within the academic circles as well, and within the level of commitment that people have to education, to the idea of academy, to the idea of understanding thoughts and process. Like intellectual engagement is like something that comes from within, right? So people who are working in the academia, are they really motivated by that kind of a drive or passion for intellectual engagement, for thinking about the world, and thinking about like ideas and understanding the history of ideas, and like in a way where it could help them sort of bring out a better perspective to sort of not only understand the world, but help other people understand the world better. I don't see that kind of drive, that kind of passion, that kind of engagement in most part of the sort of community that I deal with. It's like very rare. I'm not saying that it's non-existent. There are, of course, people who do serious work and contribute seriously, but they are very, very few. And at times, like, they feel so isolated and marginalized in the system that they eventually opt out of the system. They just leave, go to other places, like go abroad and stuff like that. So because it gets like so draining and so difficult for them to sort of just survive in an environment which is so shallow and surface level kind of engagement with everything. It's also, I think, one thing that I have become increasingly interested in over a period of time, and part of my dissertation is also sort of about looking at Gramscian notions and using them to understand the ideas of hegemony of ideas, and how sort of how certain discourses become mainstream and become sort of a part of the sort of become an accepted sort of notion, or become part of the common sense, as Gramsci would call it. And one thing that I have sort of started appreciating very deeply about Gramsci's prison notebooks and his work is that he looks at like every single aspect of social, political, economic, cultural life, as opposed to just drawing a linear, straightforward narrative of causation and talking about like this causing this. He tries to see how and why and when societies become susceptible to certain ideas. And I think in that, like his focus on the role of intellectuals, for example, and why intellectuals, for example, during his time in Italy, or even before that, when he talks about Risorgimento and stuff like that, why certain intellectuals didn't really produce things that were very constructive, and still they managed to have a huge influence amongst the population. And that tells you a lot about the character of a society and the kind of sort of socio-political preferences that people have. I think unless we understand those kinds of aspects, social aspects, cultural aspects, and political and economic aspects, we can't like really have a very clear understanding of why things are the way they are in our own sort of disciplines. So when I'm sorry, I think it's like I'm dragging it like, I've been dragging it for too long, but I'll just sort of add one more point and then we can move on to your next question, which is one of the aspects that I think has been completely missing, has been sort of completely missing out in this in these kinds of debates in Pakistan is how, for example, the neoliberal economy or the neoliberalism has sort of affected the entire socio-political and cultural space in places like Pakistan, generating a culture of sort of production and consumption, and creating this perpetual incentive for people to go for simplistic ideas. So a lot of academics become glued to realism because it's very easy to produce papers, like dozens of papers. If you are building a simplistic framework, a very straightforward linear framework, write a paper. This is like how the state is a fundamental unit. This is what the state objective is. Like this is the national interest, and this is the path from here to there. It's very easy to produce those kinds of papers, right? So in this sort of cycle of production, consumption of papers to get tenure and to get like better opportunities, and for academics, there is this very deep incentive also to go for simplicity as opposed to, simplistic arguments as opposed to really getting into getting into the more demanding stuff. So for example, if you're working on critical theories or if you are working on social constructivism, it's going to take you a while to really unearth what's really happening underneath the surface, and it's like you need to dig a lot of evidence to make a compelling argument, right? Because there's so many factors that you need to take into account to convincingly make a case, right? So I think that also adds up to sort of reinforcing of the status quo with regard to particular theoretical
Can I fear this is going to be a very simplistic question, but when you're mentioning Gramsci and all, I was thinking of Hamza Alawi's piece on Pakistan and Bangladesh. In fact, that I think was the first piece which introduced the term post-colonialism. But then I was also thinking of Vijay Prasad's book, Darker Nations, and he makes this distinction between colonels' coups and generals' coups. And he says generals' coups are usually, regressive because they're conservative, blah, blah. Colonels' coups are progressive because, they are basically speaking against the authority. They come from whatever, a different class and so on and so forth. In Pakistan's case, that's one could make, I don't know if one could make, but sort of certain generalizations about generations, right? There's a generations of 50s and of generals, whatever, they were secular and so on and so forth. And there's a post-Zia generation, there's, I guess, a post-9/11 generation of military officers who, because of constantly being at war in different places, I mean, there's a certain kind of radicalization and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of strategic thinking, and because, like you said, I mean, a lot of this field in Pakistan is about military men, them controlling the discourse. How much do you think their socialization into a particular order, whatever order that they come from, shapes the scholarship in terms of strategic issues in Pakistan?
Oh, that's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm not really sure how much of their socialization in terms of like within the military's training institutions in Pakistan affects their strategic thinking and how much of it is borrowed from abroad.
Right.
So one of the papers that I did with one of my friends, Toby Dalton, was on nuclear emulation, where we essentially sort of were arguing that the way we think about deterrence in Pakistan is basically emulation of the Cold War literature that was produced mainly in the United States, and also like the literature that was like produced mostly by the deterrence proponents, right? And sort of we tried to dig out a lot of evidence to see the connections, how much of the Cold War authors are quoted, and how sort of their thinking is sort of considered so important and so formidable in the conversations about nuclear weapons in Pakistan. And that part I see a lot in case of sort of military's articulation of its ideas about like strategy, particularly in the nuclear domain. It's like people are sent to, so I think I should make one more point on this before I move forward. We can't like really take out the fact that during the Cold War, Pakistan-US alliance, different phases of Pakistan-US alliance had a huge impact on how the military thinks about things, right? So during the Cold War, there's, and from there onwards, like until now, there have been like these cycles of cooperation, massive cooperation between the Pakistan military and the US Army. And in that process, the military officers are like the ones who are considered like bright and sharp and whatever. They are sent to the US for training programs, right? And they sort of, so in some ways it's like still a kind of a colonial trap. In some ways it's like still a very imperialistic kind of sort of notion where they go there, they get trained in the American way of thinking about strategizing and about their way of articulating problems, their way of sort of solving the problem and whatever. And when they come back with those ideas, it's like, okay, so they have learned something from the US. That means like there's some kind of a value in it, right? And then that has an impact on how they are. I'm not like, I don't want to oversimplify. I don't want to say that like there is no internal sort of, there's no appreciation of the unique challenges that Pakistan has. And within the conventional military domain, there might be discussions where those kinds of issues are brought up. I'm more aware of the conversation in the nuclear weapons related space, even within the military circles. When I go and talk to them, or when I sort of deliver lectures at Air War College or Naval War College, it's more on the nuclear side, and therefore I'm much more aware of like the kind of, when they ask questions, you get a sense of like where their thinking lies, and when they argue, you understand like where it's coming from, or even based on sort of the kind of papers that they write on nuclear stuff. I very clearly see a very, very deep imprint of the US way of thinking about military strategy. So that kind of socialization I clearly see has an impact. The socialization from within the institutions, again, I think also it's interesting to see how these institutions also at times try to mimic the institution formation in the US. So, for example, when the National Defense University was transformed from National Defense College into National Defense University, and then sort of the university was expanding itself, I was part of some of the discussions because I was working there. And a lot of times, like, people would say, okay, so we need to have this particular center because I saw this center in the NDU in Washington. And this is how the structure was, and this is how this is what they were doing. This is their mission. So you begin to see like that kind of a mirroring of, or at least there's some effort to sort of mimic what's being done there. So in that sense, if the institutions are also structured that way, of course, like there's a much more deeper imprint of that kind of socialization, and that has I think some impact. So the challenge for Pakistan basically comes from the fact that you're trying to mimic a state that has like that has so many advantages over other states, right? In terms of like its financial power, financial resources, its ability to make mistakes and get away with them. Unfortunately, I mean, they have made blunders but they can afford to, unfortunately. I mean, of course, for them to, probably there'll come a time, and that time might be approaching soon, when they'll have to pay the price for those blunders. But states like Pakistan cannot afford to get into those blunders, right? But if you are mimicking a state which is itself like, which has like serious problems in the way it conducts its security policy and the way it conceptualizes strategy, you're sort of bound to then end up in like serious trouble. And that's where I feel like that kind of there has to be some kind of disconnect in some at some point in terms of the intellectual sort of saturation or absorption of ideas and that kind of stuff.
Earlier, I mean, you mentioned that you were the only woman in the whole institute. How was that like? So in terms of like the field that you are in, nuclear strategy is notoriously, sort of a military dominated field, not just in Pakistan, but even in other places. In public discourse, of course, it is in many ways the military, even in India in some ways, like the longer your mustache, the more patriotic you are, and the more weight your views seem to get nowadays, even in India. But I'm assuming that's sort of kind of similar in Pakistan, given the history with military. And now, sort of breaching that space and being an important voice in that space, what are sorts of problems and difficulties you faced as a woman? But not just as a woman, as we were speaking earlier, there are also dimensions of class and so on and so forth. But also, I'm sort of also interested to look at the Western gaze at you. When you go to Western universities, deliver talks at Western universities, a Pakistan woman wearing a scarf, talking about nuclear strategy. I'm sure, you get quite sort of interesting reaction, as the British would say, interesting reactions from Western scholars, where I'm sure they're also trying to patronize you. So, so what sort of, so how do you navigate all that? So, and what are sorts of problems and issues there?
This is a question that I have, of course, been asked several times in like my personal conversations with friends and all. Even in Pakistan, people are like, how do you manage to navigate that space? I think the first thing that I would say is that I can't speak for all women in strategic studies in Pakistan, because in some ways I think I'm uniquely placed in a sense that I am sort of I'm situated a bit differently from sort of most of it. There are there is a fairly sort of reasonable number of young women entering this space, working on strategic studies in research institutes, think tanks, etc. But a lot of them either come from military families, or they come from civil, or they come from the families of the civil bureaucrats. So it's a very interesting, like the two power elites in Pakistan, or a few might have some sort of background with like political families, influential political families, and that kind of stuff. So I'm uniquely situated in a sense that I come from a middle-class family, a very, in some ways, non-urbanized for the very urban sensibilities of the Islamabad-based strategic elite, and and the fact that I wear a hijab. So it's interesting that within the larger Pakistani sort of society, which is relatively like much more sort of conservative, probably, you get far more sort of people, even though you don't want it or you don't do it for them, there's a higher degree of, so in some ways, approval for, like, for example, people who would wear a hijab, right? And just because of the socially conservative norms. But when it comes to the strategic elite, it's a much more sort of westernized elite. So they are generally like much more comfortable with people they think apparently can sort of can be aligned with in some ways, like in terms of their outlook, more westernized. There's much more appeal in that sense, right? So in that sense too, sort of my hijab and now there are a couple of young women in the field who wear hijab. But when I sort of stepped into this field, there was no hijab wearing women in the field. So that also was an interesting experience for me, to sort of see the reactions to it and to other things. So I would say, like, interestingly enough, when I joined the NDU and like the 2 years that I had there, I was fairly comfortable there. I don't like, despite the fact that I was, or probably because of the fact that I was the only woman, people were extra conscious. So the head of, sort of the president of the National Defense University had sort of very clearly communicated this to the staff, that I should not feel uncomfortable at any moment. And he was very considerate, like even at the time when I was joining, the thing that he said to me was that I would be very happy to have you, but I would still want you to spend at least a week or 10 days here, and then let us know whether you feel comfortable enough, because you are too young and it's like an all-men environment. So I'm not really sure how comfortable you would be. And I was like, that makes sense. And then I spent a week, and then I realized that people were very respectful to me. They didn't really sort of create any trouble and all. I mean, everybody faces few little challenges here and there, irrespective of gender. Like even if you are a young boy in an all women campus, like a female campus, teaching to younger students, you might sort of receive some kind of sort of unwanted attention, right? So those kinds of things can happen. I was pretty much prepared for it. I wasn't like really terrified by it. I knew how to deal with those kinds of situations. So in that sense, I never felt uncomfortable as a woman in that place. Part of it also was because, part of it was because people were extra conscious. Part of it was also because I was very young at that age. I grew up in a sort of patriarchal society, despite the fact that I always had a very strong rebellious kind of a streak. Even when I was growing up, like against patriarchy and against like those kinds of structures. I think the fact that like the president or the head of my own sort of think tank, which was the director general of the institute, they treated me more like a daughter, didn't feel too patronizing to me at that time. I don't really know how I would react to it now. Probably I would not be able to sort of even sort of take that. I would be like, it's not, I'm like, we need to treat each other with equal in a manner which is like more equal, as opposed to like more more like a daughter father kind of a thing. So they would keep telling me, like the DG Isra, the first day he met me, he said, like, you are my daughter's age, and therefore, like, never feel uncomfortable here. Be assured that you can come to me anytime, talk to me about any challenge that you face, and it's like I'll always treat you like that. And those words were more reassuring, more comforting, and I felt that that kind of support had put me at an ease. So it was I never thought about it like as a power question or something of that sort. But in general, after that, in particular, I think there are other kinds of experiences that I've had, and again, not just because I'm a woman, but also because of all the other things that I am, that sort of can be at times sort of uncomfortable. So so there was this one diplomat who would come to me and say, like, when I was at NDU, so he would, whenever he would come to NDU and he would visit like all the research, like all the people in the institute, he would also come to my office. And then there were a couple of moments when he said, like, you're not working for the Taliban, are you? And I would be like, what makes you think that I'm working for the Taliban? And he would be like, no, it's so difficult to place you here. Like, why would you work in an institute like this? And that was a time when NDU was receiving a lot of threats. There was this massive spike in the wave of suicide bombing attacks in different parts of Pakistan, and all the military institutions were under serious threats. And I could see his discomfort. I could see that he was assuming that probably, like, God forbid, but I'll pass on some information to somebody to sort of just breach the security and whatever. So those kinds of things. So just based on like the kind of getup you have, the fact that you wear hijab, could put some people in a bit of an uncomfortable position. I don't want to sort of overplay this part. Of course, there are a lot of people, even in the armed forces, that show you a lot of respect for the way you carry yourself and stuff like that. I think the issue of the issue of being an outsider is something which is far more important. Outsider, not just in terms of gender, outsider in terms of like the class and outsider in terms of like who you belong to and those kinds of things. I think that's what in many ways sort of defines how you are treated and what kind of responses you get from people. And in that sense, if you are an outsider, there's some kind of lack of trust. So even if you are making a very compelling argument and it challenges the status quo, the argument is very sound, it would be assumed that you are doing it either because you are working, say, for the interests of the Indians or for the Americans or for somebody somewhere. It's not like really a well-meaning contribution, right? And that kind of sort of lack of trust, I think, comes from this idea of you not being part of the clan, you not being part of that like larger circle of kinship. So if you have like if you belong to that military circle in terms of like being part of a military family or something, unless you really cross the threshold, whatever the threshold in your head is, your critique will probably be much more palatable. Once you cross that threshold, probably you'll be a much bigger traitor than any outsider could ever be, because then that means like a different kind of an act of sedition. But before the crossing that threshold, it's still seen as something coming from a position of sincerity, and I think that's where you begin to see the difference. Also, in terms of like access of information, of course, if you are not trusted enough, then there'll be less willingness to share information and stuff like that.
So have you crossed the threshold yet? Do you get access to information?
In terms of access to, I don't, I mean, I have, over the past few years, one thing that I've realized working in the nuclear weapons related field is that uh, it's almost impossible to know the real stuff, even for people who are working in the strategic plans division, people from the armed forces who are working in those departments that are like more as like departments that have this role of like the spokesperson kind of a thing, those departments of strategic plans division that engage with the rest of the world. I'm not really sure how much information they have of the actual doctrine, the actual targeting plans, the actual stuff that's going inside the planning divisions. Because again, like it's so sensitive and so secretive and all of that stuff. So, so I have sort of I have in some ways sort of redirected my research orientation, and that's not just because there is problem of access of information. That's part of the reason why I thought I should redirect my direction, but also because I'm much more interested now in more profound questions, which is like understanding why things are the way things are, as opposed to just knowing what the policy is and then sort of thinking about the policy, critiquing it, looking at like its various aspects. That I think it's increasingly I'm finding it like much more surface level, much more superficial, as opposed to the much deeper questions that help you understand why things are the way they are.
Do you also at times get tired of reading Western scholarship in Pakistan? Because there's like I was reading this book, I've forgotten the name. It is on area studies and international relations, Pakistan, where basically whenever Pakistan is discussed in international, publications, it's about either deterrence, either nuclear questions or militancy. I mean, Pakistan is the problem always, right? But you get tired of reading all of that literature, and also, and this is also sort of. I want to come to the next question about teaching as well. I mean, how much can you teach your students, the same thing about, this is how, what IR talks about Pakistan. So first about in your own research, do you get tired of it? And then I'll ask you sort of whole sets of questions.
I think that's again a very important question, and for sure I do. I feel part of the reason why I decided to sort of come for my PhD to UBC at this stage was that I was very sort of frustrated with the kind of massive failure that we have been as teachers for our students. We don't really have substantive stuff that's good enough for us to use as teaching material for our students who want to understand things the way they are and who want to be exposed to the alternative ideas. There isn't really that kind of literature coming from Pakistan. It's like so much of repetition and reproduction of the same literature that's produced in the US. So there isn't really any, both on theoretical, but also on policy front. And I feel that I am also like an equal sort of culprit in that sense. So I don't really like most of the things that I have written, except for a couple of things like that have I think that involve like much more effort and a deeper engagement. Most of the stuff, it's like policy. Most of the stuff is about policy debate. There are mostly like just two sides of the story, right? So either you're on this side of the story or on that side of the story, right? Particularly when it comes to nuclear discourse, for example, either you are on the deterrence optimist side or the deterrence pessimist side. And there isn't like really a lot of intellectually stimulating work that we have done. We've just been criticizing or supporting one way of thinking over another way of policy thinking. And that's something that becomes very it becomes deeply problematic and painful when your students ask in your class, why are we being fed with all of this literature coming from the West? Why don't we have anything of our own? And you have no answer to it. And then you are like, yeah, we need to do something about it. Like we need to contribute something much more meaningful for our students to sort of rely on for our students to get a sense of. So I think it's even when, although like there is a lot of anger at times in the strategic community that Pakistan is painted negatively, there is this victim narrative that's played out all the time. The problem is that even when people try and respond to that narrative, it's framed again in the same language, again in the same kind of sort of way of looking at the world, the same kind of understanding of the world. So it doesn't really take the conversation much like further, right? So it's like just it's a strange kind of a duel, if I may say so. It's not really an intellectual debate or in a sense something that's like really enriching and all. So that's part of and that's a very, very serious problem in teaching. But there are also sort of I think a lot of other challenges that we do face. So for example, and again, it's like all of it is so deeply rooted in the way the society and the state functions. It's not just about strategic studies. We have a serious education problem, right? So it's not that strategic studies is the only discipline where there's no real research or no real theoretical contribution and stuff like that. We don't see that happening in most of the disciplines anyway in Pakistan. So there isn't really a very rich, thorough, extensive kind of sort of research culture. So one of the problems that we face as teachers, for example, is the kind of students that we receive or we get in the university. 90% of the students who would come to study social science are the students who have not been accepted, who are not accepted in a medical school, in an engineering school, in a law school, those kinds of professional programs. People who do not really value social science, they just come to social science because they think that they don't really have anything else to do. There are some exceptions to this. There are students who, like maybe 5% or if I exaggerate the number at time, maybe 10%, but I think that's a very exaggerated figure, who come because they have a consciousness, a social consciousness. They understand what they want to do. They understand what they want to study. So they have a different kind of drive. I mean, if you have a fairly reasonable body of students who have the drive, who push you, who ask you challenging questions, that also in some ways changes the quality of teaching, and then that feeds into sort of the kind of research the teachers would do, because there is some kind of accountability, some kind of pressure inside the classroom. That kind of accountability, that kind of pressure doesn't exist in our classrooms at all, almost, right? So that becomes a challenge. But then when it comes to the university itself, and like the teaching, the quality of teaching, the instructors, and I mean, who are the people who teach? Again, that's just as I said like about the students, I think again 95% people probably don't teach in social sciences department because they are committed to the idea of social science or these like humanities, whatever you want to call it, but they want a job. So there is, and if they think that they don't have anything better to do in their view, and this is the only opportunity that they get, they end up teaching. And there is again like not that kind of drive for intellectual engagement per se, or the kind of sort of drive to pursue research, and so that's also sort of kind of a huge issue. But the other problem that has increasingly that has grown in, at least in my campus, at a structural level, is the problem because of inbreeding. So when we were studying, we had like some professors who went to US, UK, whatever, like that has its own challenges, but people who went abroad, studied, came back like with a certain set of ideas and then sort of taught those things. But they inculcated some specific schools of thought, but they professionally, at least, they were far more skilled. And now there is this entire generation of people who have done their masters and PhDs from the same university, massive kind of inbreeding, same ideas, just sort of cycling and recycling them. And then one challenge that inbreeding creates is that knowledge becomes stagnant, right? But the other problem that it creates is that it creates interest groups and stakeholders within the universities. So your supervisor has to back you when you are appearing for a faculty position. So even if there is a good candidate who has not studied from the same university, from elsewhere, the person who has already some influence within the university would get a better chance to be hired, right? So it compromises the process of hiring. Then once you are in that place, it destroys the very basis of merit, because then there are a lot of these people in different spots covering each other's back just because they know they are a product of a particular kind of status quo. And if that status quo, they'll only survive if that status quo survives, right? So there are deeper incentives to continue with a kind of terrible system.
Yeah.
And that becomes a huge sort of problem for the quality of teaching, because then people are more interested in sort of all of this dirty politics as opposed to really interested in sort of producing quality work and teaching and stuff like that. And that's like a serious problem for institutional culture as well.
Right. I mean, how much does teaching mean to you as part of the whole, portfolio of things that one does? Because I was, like you said, in terms of, students who come into humanities are basically those who don't get into engineering and medical and so on and so forth. But I guess there's also, with societies, just as I'm assuming, just like in India, I mean, we have a whole lot of these internal issues, which leads to a whole lot of people, a whole lot of young generation being angry all the time, which is good for the classroom, because it brings in new perspectives, it brings in new angles into the classroom. And I'm sure that's the same with Pakistan, with students coming from Balochistan or Northwest and so on and so forth. How much does your interaction with students shape you as a teacher, as a person, and as a researcher? How much of that has, like in my case, I'm not sure in terms, teaching shapes you, but a lot of my worldviews are opened when, I met students from Kashmir, for instance. My own classmates were from Kashmir, and it's only then that I realized, what was happening around the world and so on. So that allowed me to sort of open my worldview. So how much does that, happen to you?
I think in my case, it's like tremendous. I think teaching has been extremely, extremely influential in terms of shaping the way I think about the world, the way I think about things in Pakistan. And a lot of it has to do with students from Balochistan, students from the ex-FATA region, which is the federally administered tribal areas, students even from Gilgit-Baltistan region, because they're becoming like much more restless now. Over a period of time, I've seen like resentment grow in them and the kind of challenges that they feel. So when I say, or even students coming from the AJK, Azad Jammu and Kashmir. So so when I say that like most of the students are not really interested and committed, that's like more in academic sense.
Yeah.
So a lot of students are not very committed to the academic, to the academy in general. So they're not interested in theory stuff. They're not interested in sort of conducting research on these things and all. But when it comes to their social sense and their knowledge of what's happening on the street, that's profound, particularly for people who come from marginalized places, even students from interior Sindh and South Punjab in particular. So I think as a teacher, that's like really helpful for you, particularly when you're teaching at a federal university like Quaid-i-Azam. So the advantage that we have is that it's based on a quota system. So you get students from all parts of Pakistan. and so there is a representation of all the marginalized communities as well, and that's an eye opener for you in many ways. So I think for me, that's one reason like why I love teaching at Quaid-i-Azam so much, and I sort of want to continue doing that. It's because it's very deeply enriching and in many ways very humbling, but it also sort of puts you or it keeps you on a sort of I would like to assume on the right path, in a sense that it tells you how important it is to continue working towards certain goals, because there are people who are really, really suffering out there. And if you are living in Islamabad, which is a small elitist bubble, you can lose sight of those things very quickly and very easily. It's very difficult to imagine what's happening in Balochistan unless you really know somebody and that person is going through those kinds of experiences. There was this interesting story the other day. I was telling my supervisor, said like, do you really think that teaching has an impact? And I was telling him a story that I'll share with you too. So there was this one point when I, at the end of, I think it was 2 years back, at the end of the term, one of my students came to my office, and he was from South Punjab. So he came and he said that I want to talk to you. So I was like, sure. So he sat, and then he said that, do you know that I've been a sympathizer of the Lashkar-e-Taiba? So I was like, so as a kid, when I was growing up in my village, I was helping them like with logistical stuff and things like that. And I was like, okay, so that's interesting. And then he said that, so when you started teaching, I felt as if you were a raw agent. And I was like, okay. So he was like, I felt so uncomfortable in your classes in the beginning because I thought like you were challenging everything that I have always believed in. And then I went to my hostel, and I was telling another boy, I was saying like, there is this teacher who is saying all this stuff which is like so anti-nationalist in his view. And then he says that guy turned to me and he said that at the end of the term, you'll be speaking the same language. It's just a matter of time. And he said that I felt so bad about it, that like this guy he doesn't really understand anything. And then he said that now at the end of the term, I really feel that I am converted at heart. And now when I go back, so he said like I went back over a weekend to my hometown, and I felt that I was an outsider because anybody that I was speaking to, they thought that I've gone to a liberal university and it has changed me, and I'm like of no good anymore. And he said that although like I was treated as an outsider, I didn't feel bad at all about the fact that I am probably thinking about things much more seriously than I ever thought about them. And he basically was there. He was just saying thanks, and like he was being very polite. But I think those kinds of moments, whenever they happen, they reinforce your belief in the idea and the power of teaching. So I think in those moments, even though I might not be very happy with the fact that we are not contributing a lot at the academic level, I do feel happy about the fact that there are people who are willing to listen, but they don't really have anybody to tell them to sort of how to break the shackles of whatever is sort of imprisoning them in some ways, right, in their own head or in their own thoughts. And if you touch the lives of those people in some ways, and they feel that they have now acquired at least some sense to think about things more clearly and understand them more clearly, there might be a little impact, like it might be like a droplet in a desert, but I think that counts.
Thank you very much, Sadia. That's a beautiful note to finish on, and I can't thank you enough for doing this interview. I should say I've never enjoyed talking to a strategic studies expert as much as I've enjoyed speaking with you. But thank you so much very much again. doing
Thank
this.
you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you too.